Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Hello, my name is Jack Shaw. I'm the District Manager for the UK and Scandinavia here at Regenesis, and thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, should you experience any sound or connectivity issues during the webinar, then the best thing for you to do would be to end your webinar session, close your browser, and log back in again. This normally solves the majority of the problems that we encounter. And hopefully you can get back onto the webinar. This will be recorded, so if there are any persistent problems, you will have an email with access to the recording at the end. During this webinar, if you have any questions during or after the main presentation, we encourage you to post it using the webinar questions panel that you should see on your screen. We will then collect those questions and then do our best to answer them at the end of the webinar. This is about an hour's talk, so we may not get to all of them. If we don't get to your question, either myself or Marcello will answer them separately. We'll drop you an email or set up a call. As I say, if we run out of time, we'll get back to your questions within the next couple of days. So today's presentation is a dual presentation, so I'll be doing part of it, but my colleague Marcello Carboni, who's the Regional Manager of Europe, will be doing the bulk of this presentation. Marcello is the European Regional Manager at Regenesis, and in his current role, he coordinates the sales activities across Europe and assesses the development in potential new countries. But from 2011 to 2018, Marcello was the district manager of the Mediterranean district within Regenesis. And that's why he's here today to talk about this project that is based in Italy. We'll be talking about a project where we took a site where you had DNAPL concentrations of chlorinated solvents to non-detect. It was a significant project for us at the time, a project that started in 2015 and then was closed out in 2020. So we'll be, within this webinar, we'll go over the case study. So it'll be mostly focused on the case study. We'll look at the project, the site features and the remediation concept, technologies used and the results. I'll also spend some time focusing on the legislation around contaminated land within Italy. It's very different to here in the UK. It's somewhat different to Scandinavia as well. They're very heavily and very stringently regulated in Italy. And then we'll do a quick overview of in situ technologies for chlorinated solvent sites. We'll look at where you should use them and where other technologies would be more appropriate. How we as Regenesis select those technologies based on what you tell us, and how the combination of them can lead to the desired result, be that a site cleaned up very quickly, or a site where you clean it up at a much slower pace, but it's much more cost effective. And then finally, we will finish off with a series of questions and answers. So just about the project, the specific points of interest here. We are looking at a site where we had concentrations of chlorinated solvents, particularly TCE, where it would suggest that there was DNAPL, so dense non-aqueous phase liquids, free-phase chlorinated solvents in the groundwater. In Italy, they have incredibly stringent targets, particularly when it comes to the off-site migration of contamination, and I'll go into that in a little bit of detail. So we had to go from DNAPL to essentially below detection limit. We have a really long data set here. This is something that you often don't get if the site is driven by development, or if you don't have any, where you don't have very low targets that you need to hit. So here we're fortunate enough to have a really long data set that robustly validates the remediation completed on this site. Here they were also dealing with challenging geology, and historically other remediation technologies had been trialed, but enhanced reductive dechlorination was chosen. The treatment area is large. It is it's over 6,000 square meters that had to be treated across this site. It also had to be cost effective, and really here the client wanted a balance between cost, time, and surety, with surety being the key criteria. Often when we are reviewing sites, it's either it's it's a balance between the amount of money that people are looking to spend to remediate a site versus the amount of time they have. Here, for this particular site, what they were looking for was surety of success. And actually, they had a lot of time to clean up this particular site. They weren't looking to sell it immediately. The client, because they were looking for that surety, wanted a guaranteed success. So we, as Regenesis, had to stand by this design and guarantee that it would work. As I mentioned, we then obtained formal site closure from the Italian environment, EPA, the Italian Environment Agency. And yeah, overall, it was a great project. Overall, where this project was based is in northeast Italy, not too far from the Slovenian border. The site is some 10 kilometers inland, but it borders a river that then runs into a lagoon. So the site itself, the geology and geography is a very flat area between a lagoon, the sea, and then the mountains, so not too dissimilar to Venice. The surrounding area largely comprises reclaimed land from wetlands, though the site itself wasn't situated on a reclaimed land. The geology that we were looking to remediate was a series of river deposits, so alluvium material. And as is the nature with alluvium, there were low permeability formations within the sands, gravels, and clays that had to be targeted. Being close to the sea and being close to this lagoon, there were tidal effects on the river nearby and impacts to the water as well. But within Italy, and it's very different to here in the UK, they are very stringently regulated when it comes to contaminated land, and particularly when it comes to the off-site migration of contaminated groundwater. Remediation legislation allows only for a risk-based approach within the property. So you can only complete risk assessments within the property itself. There's then stringent national limits at the site's boundary. So they are comfortable with the concept of site-specific risk assessment when you are looking within the site boundary. However, as soon as that contamination crosses the site boundary, you have to hit minimum cleanup standards that are set at the national level. This is all about the risk to third parties, and this risk and this modelling then also has an impact on how a risk-based approach is conducted within the site, because really you're only monitoring that 10, 20, 100 meters, if you're lucky, bit of aquifer you have for that plume to attenuate. So often you have to clean up to stringent targets anyway. Validation and verification is also very detailed. There's a lot of oversight, regulatory oversight. When you are completing your validation and verification monitoring, the Italian Environment Agency will also attend site, take samples, and analyze 10% of the samples that they take. And your samples that you take as the environmental consultant or remediation contractor, and the samples that the Environment Agency takes and then has analyzed by their own laboratories, have to match. So you have this duplicate sampling that is peer reviewed by the Environment Agency during the verification and validation process. Compliancy has to be compliancy on both parties, and from both parties is required, and that verification has been done correctly. And you also have this, therefore, a very long monitoring program before you hit compliance. So something else that isn't accepted is variations in sample. So if you have continually low concentrations of a contaminant in your groundwater samples, so you've got 9 months of very low levels, and then for whatever reason you get a spike, this is not considered noise. This is almost resets the process again. So there's no risk-based approach when it comes to off-site impact. You can't do it statistically. Often sites are under emergency containment. So, and I believe it was the case for this site, if there is a perceived risk, or if it has been proven that the contamination is moving off-site, then a pump and treat system is immediately deployed to contain that plume, to stop it moving off-site. Often this happens before a site further detailed site investigation is completed, that some sort of hydraulic containment has to be deployed to stop that offsite migration of contamination. So the history of this particular site, so it was a decommissioned manufacturing facility that ceased operations in 2006. The site, though, had a long history of industrial processes. So the client that we worked for bought this site in the 1980s and ran it until around 2006. But before then, it was a metal plating works, and before then, it was a sugar factory. And actually, the TCE contamination to the ground, while our client also used TCE in the manufacture of fiberglass products, because there was also a metal plating works before, our client was not able to say for sure that the contamination was historic. The site, however, was in somewhat of a rural area, so the land value, despite it being quite a large site, was low. So that then had an impact on the amount of money the client was willing to spend on remediating the site. The intention here was that once the site was remediated, they would sell the property. The reason for this is historically this client had sold a site whilst they retained that liability and the requirement to maintain the remediation. But they found that this was difficult, negotiating access with the new landowner, continuing to manage that liability. So here what they wanted to do was remediate the site and then sell it clean. So there was no ongoing liability there afterwards. Here, though, we were lucky. They didn't have a buyer lined up for the site. They were just being told by the Italian Environment Agency that they had to make sure that off-site migration of contamination wasn't happening. So there was no demand on time. So here we were fortunate that we had the time to remediate this site. They also were looking for guarantees. So while there wasn't any time pressure, the real pressure from the client was that they wanted guaranteed success on this particular site. So that balance of time, cost, and surety, here the key thing was surety. They wanted this site to be cleaned up, for us to hit these stringent targets so that they could sell it with no liability. So surety was the main driver from a commercial point of view.
Okay, thanks,
Jack.
Jack.
No problem at all.
Hello, everybody. So I will go into more details of a site. And first of all, we can see an overview of a site. The first thing that captured the eye is the fact that there is this river down gradient at the site boundary. And if we look at the contamination, we see that we get basically two sources, and basically we get one source which is more up gradient, which is minimal, not very big, but the biggest one is the one more down gradient, which has created a big plume, which is intercepting the property boundaries. This made, as Jack said, the necessity for them, the site owner, to put in place an hydraulic containment via pump and treat, and this was done in 2009. We are also having quite challenging conditions for what concerns geology and hydrogeology. We are in a high heterogeneity layers intercalated between them, basically low permeability. And when we are getting low permeability and high heterogeneity, these are conditions that usually become pretty challenging for in situ remediation with injectable products. These low permeability layers made that the vertical transport of the contamination was somehow inhibited. So even if the superficial aquifer goes until 25 meters, the majority of the contamination stands up to 11 meters. There are just some smaller hotspots which are getting into 18, 20 meters below ground level. And these are the maximum concentrations that have been identified by the consultant during investigation. This is unsaturated soil. And these are the maximum concentrations in groundwater. Both these maximum concentrations are around here in the downgradient source. So the overall area, which is above the threshold limits, it's 20,000 square meters over an entire property, which is about 60,000 square meters. Thanks to risk assessment, a big portion could be risked away, and it remained only 6,500 square meters to be proactively remediated. Here we can see how the TCE contamination is going, and here how the vinyl chloride contamination. And if I can color, no, sorry, I can't color, but just if you can follow my pointer, the main remediation area is this one where you see the high vinyl chloride concentration, but there are also two other spots. So one here, also at the boundary, and one here in the source one. The source one is mainly chloroform and dichloropropane, so different chlorinated solvents compared to the main contaminant of concern, which is TCE and its daughter product. About the targets, at the property boundaries, no way to escape from the stringent table limits, and those are the ones that we are seeing in the last column. So 1.5 micrograms per liter TCE, 0.5 micrograms per liter vinyl chloride. These, since the beginning, we knew that was the most challenging value to reach. Internally, different targets depending on the different areas and how risk assessment has been assessed. Not as stringent as the boundary targets, but anyway need to reduce of different order of magnitudes compared to the existing concentration. On top of this, also the validation method that was used was rather complex. In Italy, it is already usually complex. This is way beyond the average even. So we are having a network of monitoring wells of 34 wells. These have all been used in the ongoing monitoring during the remediation and for the validation. And all of them need to be compliant. So 25 are in internal areas, outdoor and indoor, 9 wells at the site boundaries, and are the same wells which in 2009 have been put under pump and treat. This pump and treat couldn't be switched off until there was complete compliance in the single well confirmed on multiple campaigns. Once it was switched off, then if there was any rebound, the pump and treat needed to be switched on again. And rebound means even just getting 0.6 micrograms per liter vinyl chloride. So only when all the network was in parallel, so at the same time, completely compliant for 2 consecutive campaigns, then would start the post-remediation validation, which would last 1 year, and it comprised quarterly monitoring. And this, it was quite extenuating, but at least gave us the chance to get a very long data set in monitoring, which is not very frequent on our remediation side. So we can see how the reagents perform over a very long term. And indeed, what we ended up achieving was a 5 to 6 order of magnitude reduction in total chlorinated, 6 orders in the TCE alone. And finally, when this was obtained and validated, then the expensive pump and treat could be switched off, and this happened in 2021. So what was the concept of the remediation that the consultant evaluated? For soil, there were basically no other options, so the two source areas have been excavated. Mainly the unsaturated, so there was very limited excavation in the inside the aquifer, and also the areas which had been excavated were quite limited. So these for logistic issues and also for not expanding too much with the cost. So this meant that some areas outside excavation remain with saturated contamination, which was pretty significant. Also some areas with suspected DNAPL present. But for the groundwater, since the area to be remediated was 6,500 square meter, was fairly too much to approach with an ex situ technique, and also pump and treat, which was already there as a containment, was not really a solution because it was not providing the chance to get the internal values to be lower down to a risk assessment target level. So for groundwater, they decide, apart from the pump and treat, to go for an injection of product, and they didn't really know what would have been the best option. So they decided to make a comparative pilot test in the field. It was compared sodium permanganate as an ISCO agent versus enhanced reductive dechlorination using our 3D macroemulsion. I will show later, but then the results from that was that ERD performed way much better compared to ISCO. So this has been the technology that has been selected for the remediation of the entire site. So the entire contaminated area received an application of electron donors, and the goal for this application was a massive mass reduction in the entire site, and also to achieve the internal targets in all the internal areas, so in the 25 internal monitoring wells. We already knew or suspected since the beginning that this could have not been enough for reaching the stringent table limits. Why? Because sometimes when you get to the microgram per liter range, then the kinetics of the biodegradation slows down. You can get instability in the outcomes, and we couldn't allow for any instability. We needed to reach almost non-detect on all the line boundary towards the river. So we planned since the beginning to go and support the ERD with in situ sorption, applying a colloidal activity carbon, applying plume stop. This just towards the portion of the property boundary which didn't reach with phase one complete remediation. And after a pilot test, then the full scale of the plume stop has been done in 2018, and this allowed for complete compliance also at the property boundaries. So I will cut the short short because of time, just to say that during the pilot test, ISCO showed to be with rebound effect. So after an initial reduction in concentration, they bumped up again. And this meant that if we wanted to remediate with ISCO, then multiple campaigns for sure would be needed. And also to be applied in a very tight grid. And this made that in an estimation to bring ISCO to full scale, the application costs were too high. So ISCO was discarded for these reasons as an option. And this is really something we tend to see quite frequently, and is also why we rarely, with chlorinated solvents, use our Regenox or Persofox, our oxidizers. It's because we can leverage instead other technologies such as ERD, bloom stop, ISCR with zero valent iron, which instead can get remediation with one single injection campaign. So I'll hand over to Jack again, which will illustrate what are in details the electron donors that have been chosen for this slide.
No problem at all. Thank you, Marcello. Let's see if we can get this to work. Perfect. So what we're looking to do is to enhance the reductive dechlorination process. So this is the natural attenuation of chlorinated solvents. And this is done by a group of microbes, dehalogenating bacteria, such as D. halichoides and D. halobacter, that utilize hydrogen as an electron donor. They exchange it across, they swap it across for a chlorine atom. You can see that's what they've been doing here now, degrading TCE to DCE, degrading TCE to DCE to vinyl chloride, and then eventually all the way through to ethene, which is this harmless byproduct. Now, the way of accelerating this natural attenuation process is by applying an electron donor. Now, this isn't something that Regenesis had invented. ERD within the remediation of chlorinated solvents has been done for well over 20 years. However, it started with the use of inappropriately soluble substrates. So what do I mean by that? I mean things like molasses, things like lactate that you would either inject into the aquifer and they would release hydrogen very quickly and wash out, or you inject them into the aquifer, they stick and they don't release enough hydrogen to get this reductive dechlorination process going. So in the late 90s, engineered controlled release substrates came onto the market, and 3DME is one of those. These are substrates that have been engineered to be appropriately soluble. So when you inject them into the subsurface, they don't wash out, they stick around, but they also release hydrogen at an appropriate rate, so you can grow a large microbial consortia in the aquifer, so you can break down as much contamination as possible. This overcomes the problem of vinyl chloride stall. So as Marcello alluded, remediation targets here were very low, vinyl chloride in particular. Vinyl chloride, of all of those breakdown products, so vinyl chloride and DCE we sometimes refer to as daughter products, PCE and TCE we would refer to as parent compounds. Of all of these compounds, vinyl chloride is the most soluble, most mobile, and also most toxic. So what you don't want to do, you don't want to take your TCE problem and turn it into a vinyl chloride problem. And a way of ensuring that is using these engineered substrates that have been designed from the molecule up, in the case of 3DME, to be appropriately soluble so that you get that full dechlorination right the way through to ethene. Crucially here, what we're doing is we're avoiding the need for multiple applications as well, so it keeps the project costs low. 3DME, it is a molecule that we literally invented for this process. So what you have here, you have a lactic acid tetramer, which has an ester bond, and then on the end of that, we've stuck some fatty acids to create this polar molecule. But when you mix it 10:1 with water, you can create this emulsion, which you then inject into the subsurface. It creates these micelles that then self-distribute and will release hydrogen for up to 5 years. Now, we have had sites where the release profile has been much longer, but typically we would expect 3DME to, after a single injection, continue to release hydrogen for 5 years, so that you create this stable environment in the aquifer so you can grow this large microbial consortia so you get full dechlorination. What happens when you inject it into the subsurface? the 3-DME molecule, it will start to dissolve. And as it dissolves, it will ferment and it will release, sorry, I'm having some problems with my video here. It will release lactic acid, which is then broken down, will release lactate that is then broken down by fermenters, and these fermenters then release hydrogen that is then utilized in the reductive dechlorination process. So you're breaking down, so you're continuing to release hydrogen for this 5-year process, so you get that full dechlorination right the way through to ethene. And this is typically what we would expect to see. So that breakdown of PCE and TCE, often that happens quite quickly. There is a bit of a kinetic disparity between the speed at which all of these compounds break down. It can often then take a little bit of time for the DCE to break down. You'll then see a vinyl chloride peak and then ethene. So that's the results that we're looking to see. We also utilized another electron donor called HRC. HRC comes in a series of blends. So there's primer, HRC, and then HRCX. We mixed all of these three together to give you a similar release profile that you have for 3-DME. But here we utilize this in combination with plume stop along the barrier, along the down gradient edge of the site.
Okay, I'm back.
Sorry, is that over to you? No problem.
So let's get into the details of the remedial design. I can move. Okay. So basically, all the site has been divided into sub areas, which each of them received a tailored dosing of our electron donors. So the majority of the site, all the internal areas, received as main electron donor the 3D macroemulsion. If you look, we went using a grid up to 6 meter by 6 meter. This is very wide, and this is just thanks to the optimal capability of distribution that 3DME has. Remind that this is a very challenging geology. In higher permeability sites, we can go even much wider spacing than this. Then, just at the edge of the site, at the boundary, we did apply the HRC, and this is because we knew that the plume stop was to be applied here, and so for a complete compatibility with the colloidal electron donor. So here, but in any case, whichever electron donor has been used, then we did apply very long lasting. So to go for one single injection, which could cover the entire dechlorination pathway until its completion. And here we get the chance to see those sub areas. It has been chosen a strategy which went for grid in order to cover completely this contaminated area, and we did not apply instead injectable barriers. This is for multiple reasons. One reason is because the plume in reality in many areas was getting a lot of mass, and therefore it would have given probably an excessive time for the complete remediation. And this was okay, but the client didn't have a lot of time pressure, but this was beyond the scale of expectation of time they had. Some pictures about the application. So this area here has been used as a centralized mixing area of our reagents, which then delivered through high pressure pipes the product towards the injection rig, the direct push injection rigs. We went in parallel with two geoprop, and this was because of the high number of injection points, so to try to reduce the time scale. And let's get into the results, which probably it's the most interesting part. So results from the enhanced reductive dechlorination phase. And let's see first what's happening in the main source area. This well I'm showing, it's located here. It's within the excavation of the Vaduzon soil that has been done. This graph gives back a dechlorination curve that it's almost from a manual. It's very tidy, it's very clean. It's not really frequent, but sometimes it happens. We clearly see a peak of DCE, which is around here 4 months after the end of injection. Vinicuride peak somehow 9 months. Majority of the dechlorination going in 1.5 years, and then continual reduction in concentration. What's happening in another well, and indeed this well shows the worst concentration in the entire site. We are here at starting concentration of over 200,000 microgram per liter. It's here where the consultant suspected presence of DNAPL in droplets, even if they have never been able to detect them directly. Much higher mass, much longer process. You see that it's taking basically almost 3 years until depleting the entire mass. So we see that ERD, whenever the mass is really high, it can be much slower because we do not need to deplete and make the microbes digest just what's in the dissolved phase, but we have additional mass in the saturated soil and in here also in the free phase. But what's important is that we just need to wait longer time. So thanks to this highly performant electron donor, we just relied on the injection provided here back in 2015, and we just need to monitor the effect over longer term. And here we get the chance to observe 18 production. 18 is the last one of the chain, so it's indirectly an evidence of full dechlorination, and we can see where there is much higher mass. Also, the 18 production is more significant, and it goes towards a much longer period. What's happening in the plume? So in the area in between the source and the boundaries. Here, this well, it's located here, and it's internal of the area that has been used for the pilot test, which was back in 2013. So this has got the longest data set of the entire site, so 8 years of monitoring. In full scale, this area has not been repeated with injection. There was no need. So everything is relying on the initial injection. And we see that basically starting from 2016, we already had non-detect on all the contaminants of concern. So more than 5 orders of magnitude reduction in this case. Another well located here. So depending basically on the well we select and the mass which is associated in this in the area in the surrounding, we get a similar behavior but with different timeline depending on the total mass. And what's happening at the boundaries? Some wells went down really well. For example, this well, it was compliant after 1 year, and in this case, compliant being at the boundary means reaching the 1.5 DCE, the 60 DCE, and 0.5 vinylchloride. So these wells did not need any colloidal activated carbon application, and this happened to, let's say, there was a line of totaling 130 meters, which before the remediation was non-compliant at the boundary. 40 meters happened to be fully compliant with the ERD phase. For the remaining 90 meters, the situation was like we are seeing in this one. So some mass reduction, but decreasing concentration, but in most of cases fluctuating around lower level, and in some cases even fluctuating or getting longer time set because of a high mass, which is also present at the site boundary. So for all these areas, then we needed to go for a phase 2. So stabilizing and promoting further the enhanced reductive dechlorination using the colloidal activity carbon plume stop in order to get rapidity, speeding up the kinetics again, and getting stability on the data. But let's see what we are observing from the site scale. So TCE, which is the parent compound, of course, is getting down weaker because it's the first one of the chain to be depleted. DCE, it's coming afterwards. So we are seeing that it takes more than 1 year to get out from the site. And then vinyl chloride, being the last one of the chain, is the one which is remaining on the longer term. And if we see, then this well is the one that I've showed you before, saying that it's the one with the highest concentration on the entire site. So I am handing over back to Jack again, which will focus on what's the plume stop technology that we use as a second phase. On to you, Jack.
No problem at all. So there we go. So what is plume stop? So first of all, so plume stop is a technology that was released in 2014, and it comprises finely milled granular activated carbon that we've milled down to 1 to 2 microns. So that's the size of a bacterium. That's the size of a red blood cell. It's smaller than a pore throat. And what we've done is we've coated it in a polymer to get it to move and behave like a colloid. So blood is a colloid, wine is a colloid. It flows very freely in the aquifer matrix. And these carbon particles then, we've charged them in such a way that instead of them clumping together, they repel from each other and they stick to the aquifer matrix. So the use of plume stop in situ, you can paint the subsurface with carbon. It distributes very well. So when we're installing these plume stop barriers or completing plume stop treatment, what we want to do is to ensure that you get an even distribution of carbon so that there's no gaps. And then you have the plume stop itself then provides absorption sites incredibly quickly. All in, it converts the underlying geology into a purifying filter. It took a while for us to release this technology. It's not an easy thing to do, milling the carbon evenly and developing these dispersive polymers. The R&D process first started going in 2007, and then we did the commercial launch in 2014, and then we saw commercial applications take off from 2015 and onwards. In terms of just a side-by-side analysis, you can just appreciate the power of colloidal activated carbon. On the left, what you will see is plume stop milled down to 1 to 2 microns with dispersion agent. And then on the right, you have PAC, powdered activated carbon. So what you can see here is a series of photographs taken over 12 minutes. What we've done is just flush 14 pore volumes of water through these columns. And you can see that the plume stop coats those sand grains, coats that silty sand, whereas the powdered activated carbon hasn't moved very far at all. So when you inject plume stop, you've got a before shot there of your sand grains. You get this wide distribution, and it coats those sand grains with 2 micron scale activated carbon particles. You then get contaminant absorption, so you get absorption of your TCE and vinyl chloride. And when you combine plume stop with an electron donor, such as HRC, you can create this growth of this biofilm. Now, these microbes that break down chlorinated solvents, these Dehalobacter, Dehalococcoides bacteria, they aren't planktonic. They don't swim around in the aquifer kind of like seeking out contamination to metabolize. They aren't like fish. They're more like sea sponges. They sit on the aquifer matrix and they secrete this thing called a biofilm. And the job of this biofilm is that it captures the contamination so that the microbe can metabolize it. So you get contaminant absorption. We've got enough electron donor in the mix to make sure that there's enough hydrogen so that these microbes can metabolize this contamination and that the conditions are correct. This then promotes biological degradation of the chlorinated solvents in situ. And then as those chlorinated solvents are degraded, more sorption sites then get freed up on the plume stop matrix. So that means that any influx or back diffusion of contamination can be captured, and then around and around you go. So you've created this positive feedback loop. You've engineered a self-cleaning carbon filter in the subsurface. I always think of it as a self-cleaning Brita filter in the subsurface.
Okay, so
No problem.
let's move quickly on to the results from this plume stop phase. And I'll show you the worst well at the site boundaries. So the other wells performed much quicker. So here we see the entire treatment. So what the electron donor did as a reduction in total mass, but it's really just when we injected the plume stop that the process becomes faster. So the speed of remediation with plume stop becomes really, really quick. So it's really the first months after application where we see a decreasing trend. But we need to get into the lower concentration to observe more in detail what's happening. So we are getting a decreasing concentration. We are also observing an increase in 18, and for the following months and years, most of the time 18 was almost the only compound detected, and this indirectly is a confirmation that the biodegradation is occurring within mass of contaminants of vinyl chloride, which is sorbed onto the activated carbon. Why it didn't go down and stop very quickly? Because if we are observing on the logarithmic scale, and it might be confusing, but the vinyl chloride is this purple line. So this line is the threshold, 0.5. If we see we are getting down the table limit already some months after, but then there were some fluctuation of levels, sometimes even just above 0.5, sometimes on the microgram per liter range, but this was still considered non-compliancy and forced to maintain the pump and treat ongoing. It was then in 2020 when it finally went down definitely, and this is when in 2020 it even went to the 1 year of post validation monitoring. The other wells did arrive to this situation much quicker. So what are the takeaways that we can get from this case study? First of all, that the site has been successfully completely remediated, even if we were starting with a significant mass, and everything was possible to be achieved with one single application. And let me explain better this concept. We see two phases, but in reality, it is one single application, because internally we are doing an unproductive dechlorination with 3D macroemulsion. At the site boundary, the strategy in its entirety, it's plume stop. The plume stop, it's a platform technology. Plume stop, it's always co-applied with an electron donor if we're using chlorinated solvents. We just brought forward the application of electron donors to be able to lower down the concentration until the level of, sorry, I just realized my face was not in, until the moment that we get concentrations which are feasible for treatment for plume stop. So when we applied plume stop in 2018, we didn't reapply the electron donor. The electron donor, we relied on hydrogen production to very long-term release electron donors performed in 2015. And even if there was a very extremely challenging monitoring, then we have been able to fully achieve complete compliance in all the monitoring network. And the post-remediation validation has been completed, and this granted for complete remediation and closure of the site. On its entirety, we observed in many wells 6 orders of magnitude reduction on TCE, 5 to 6 on average on the total chlorinated. And it is to be noted that for 16 wells, so about 50% of the network, we reached stably non-detect concentration, so nothing was detected on the analysis on all the contaminants of concern. So overperforming what was requested, even if the request for remediation was pretty challenging. So back in 2021, it was possible to switch off the pump and treat after 12 years of hydraulic containment, and then formally getting the site closure sign-off by the authorities, which arrived 1 year later, so just in beginning of this year. As Jack was mentioning at the beginning, the client needed to get surety on the results. So they needed to allocate a budget for remediation since the site was dismantled and the, this branch of the business was closed. So they needed to get surety that this was possible to be performed at fixed price without no surprise. So each of the 2 phases received a guarantee to the client, which meant for phase 1, reaching in all the internal wells the site-specific target level, and reaching at the boundaries concentration low enough to get the possibility to apply plume stop. So this is at a few milligrams per liter range in chlorinated. Then when we passed on to phase 2, the guarantee was converted into getting complete boundary compliance and therefore possibility to close the site remediation. In order to do that, it's of course not something we do for each single application, but it's something that Regenesis can provide in case of interest. In order to do that, all the parties involved, all the stakeholders need to agree on the site conceptual model. So concluding, we have seen how integrated remediation has optimized the efficiency. So thanks to the high efficiency of electron donor, we got dramatic reduction with a single application, 1 to 3 years time, depending on the mass initially present. Then combining this ERD with in situ sorption of the boundary is what allowed to reach the restringent target in a way which is cost effective and feasible to be implemented. And so you have seen that despite of the multiple challenges, so technical geology, concentration, but also the scenario about the very low target, we have provided a cost-effective remediation, which is well suitable for treating also large-scale projects. So I will hand over to Jack, which will guide us through the latest part. I think we are quite running out of time, so onto you, Jack, and we will see each other again in the final Q&A.
No problem at all. So here we go, smooth as always. How do you know, if you're looking at this site and you're thinking, okay, there's lots of ways we can tackle chlorinated solvent contamination, how do you select the most appropriate strategy for the site? And it's something that really is both Marcello and my day job, is to talk to you guys about your sites to make sure that we are recommending the correct technology, not only from a commercial point of view, not only from a technical point of view, but also, you know, the commercial realities. They're looking to clean this site up quickly or slowly. Have we got money to spend, or is the land value quite low? And we have a suite of technologies out there that can address chlorinated solvents in situ. Most of them have been talked about today, with the exception of BDI, which is an inoculum, and then our chemical oxidants as well. But most recently, and really prior to the commencement of this job, we have released a technology called S-Micro ZVI. Now, it's a sulfadated colloidal zero valent ion technology. What we have done is, instead of enhancing the rate of reductive dechlorination utilizing an electron donor, so we talked about this, is what 3DME does, where you dechlorinate your PCE, TCE right the way through to ethene using a biological process. Here we're using an abiotic process where we are forcing chemical reduction utilizing sulfadated zero valent ion, so reduction through a beta pathway. So you bypass the production of these daughter compounds, and is particularly effective on higher concentrations of PCE and TCE. It's reduced to chloroacetylene and then acetylene, and then eventually through to ethene. So you can shortcut this the production of vinyl chloride and DCE, or you can certainly reduce the amount that is created. In terms of what zero valent ion is, it needs to be manufactured. It's an engineered compound. Iron typically wants to be in an oxidative state. You have to manufacture zero valent ion. The thing is, it's also been used in much in the same way that electron donors were used for decades within the remediation industry, but it has a lot of challenges around it. There's a balance between reactivity and persistence, and then also the ease of delivery on site. So my personal experience with commodity ZVI is, as a remediation engineer trying to get it into the ground, it can be a very difficult thing to apply and install. Now, we as Regenesis, with the releasing S-Micro ZVI, have looked at improving not only the efficiency of the reaction and improve performance, but also how you can handle it, making it safe on site, and also the economics as well. What we've done balancing that reactivity and persistence thing, characteristic, has been to coat it with an iron sulfide to make it slightly hydrophobic, so that you improve the efficiency of the exchange of electrons when it comes to reducing chlorinated solvents in situ. So zero valent iron is very reactive. It wants to react with everything, including water. Can produce hydrogen, not a bad thing, can help establish the conditions in the aquifer quicker, so you get reductive dechlorination happening, but it's not what we want it to do. What we want it to do is chemically reduce, the chlorinated solvents in situ. In terms of its delivery and ease of use, so it's a colloid, so what you can see there is we're pouring liquid iron that's been milled down to 1 to 5 microns into a mix of 3DME. So you can see we're not dealing with a powder here, we're dealing with a liquid that you mix with water and then inject, and it flows and behaves in a very similar way to plume stop. With this project, you could have utilized S-Micro ZVI to shorten the program. So if they had a buyer lined up, if the client had a buyer lined up, we could have accelerated that program, so we could have closed that site out sooner. There could have been a cost reduction. utilizing barriers as well. But as I said before, what the client was looking for was surety. They were looking for surety first and foremost, and actually they had a lot of time. So utilizing ZVI in this case would have shortened the time and also meant that we were spending more money, but actually the most appropriate and efficient thing for this site, because we had that time, was to go down an electron donor only route for this particular case. So in conclusion, there's lots of technologies available out there that can be delivered utilizing injectable substrates to remediate sites that are impacted with chlorinated solvents. They're fully integratable, so you can use most of these technologies as part of a treatment train or together. But what we really strive for when we're talking with clients is, do feel free to get us involved early. It helps us make sure that all the information's there so we can provide you with a detailed design. And that conversation, we're going to be talking to you about the geology, concentrations on site, targets, treatment depths, time, access, budget. All of these things are important when it comes to selecting a technology. And I'd also just like to thank Marcello for taking the time to talk us through this particular project. For me, somebody that works primarily within the UK and Scandinavia, what really the thing that I really took home was how stringent the targets are, and how with extended validation monitoring you could you can really prove that you're not getting back diffusion or rebound of contamination post injection, which we often don't get in the UK if we're looking for betterment or we don't have to hit these particularly low targets. So Marcello, I know we've run over a fair bit.
Yeah.
Should we maybe do one question
Yeah, I mean, what we could do if you're fine with it, we could do some questions. Then we are running out of time, but if people need to leave, then they can leave and they will watch the Q&A in the recording session, because we will send in few days from today a recording, so they can watch in later time the Q&A. So I don't know, maybe let's start. Let's see
see how we go.
In the question, and let's see where we get.
Perfect. So if I take the ones that are more about technology, and maybe if you do the project specific ones.
Okay.
So it's always the first question asked after when are we, well, no, it is the first question that someone will always ask me. What was the cost of this this project?
Okay, yes, sorry, I didn't mention it during my presentation. It was about 2 million euros overall for the remediation, maybe something less. It might seem a high number. We need to consider the context in which we are. So first of all, it's a big area that was treated. To also a deep treatment. So we treated the entire site up to 11 meters below ground level, but also some areas needed to be treated until 20 meters. If we go to unit costs, I think we come over around 30 euros per cubic meter treated. We also need to consider the scenario in which we are working, which is really high starting concentration, dropping down to basically non-detect everywhere. So this makes that the costs need to be a little bit higher, because we need to provide a lot of consistency in our remedial approach, and also, of course, the fact that we needed to guarantee the costs to the client.
Cool. I have a couple of technology ones. So two on plume stop and one on the treatment approach. So I'll go through these quite quickly. The first question, to paraphrase it, with high concentrations, would there have been a better approach to go for? With reductive chlorination, you can, unlike petroleum hydrocarbon contamination, where if you have free-phase petroleum hydrocarbons, the most efficient and appropriate thing to do would be to pump them off, to do some sort of physical treatment to remove the free-phase contamination. With chlorinated solvents, you really can, go for milligrams per liter of TCE in the groundwater, utilizing ERD to reduce them in situ. This is really why I asked Marcello to come and talk about this particular case study today. Here in the UK, this would be a fairly average chlorinated solvent site. Much lower concentrations often would get risked away. So it really highlights how enhanced reductives of chlorination, using an electron donor that has been engineered to be specifically soluble, can address these really high concentrations after a single injection. As I mentioned as well, now we have S-micro ZVI, so that can be co-applied with 3DME, and that can accelerate the whole process, and that would be really useful if you were looking to redevelop or sell the site quite quickly. So that's broadly with these high concentrations, absolutely, for chlorinated solvents in situ can be the way to go. The other two questions I have are just on plume stop. So does the plume stop need to be reapplied? And then in the similar theme, do you need to remove it after treatment? So in this case, and generally not in my experience, for chlorinated solvent contamination, you don't need to reapply plume stop. The idea is that by co-applying it with electron donors, you create this self-cleaning filter in the subsurface, so there's no need to reapply to keep this process going. It's not like PFAS, maybe this is where this question is coming from, where we say after X many years you need to reapply. Here we're actually degrading the contamination through the reductive chlorination process. In terms of removal, again, no, there's no need to remove it, sort of in any case really. The activated carbon will remain in place for a very long time, for decades really. It's probably going to stay active for decades. After hundreds of years, what will happen is it will just compost down, so it's and be converted to regular carbon. So you're not modifying the subsurface in any way that you need to remove it. So some site-specific ones for you, Marcello.
Okay.
I don't know if I can group them. Hang on a minute. Could you have just done a plume stop barrier, like as a standalone treatment, or just use plume stop on the entire site? And then there was another question about, is remediation in Italy always, does remediation in Italy always take much longer than it would do in the UK?
About the first question, probably not. So plume stop alone, just an injectable barrier at the boundaries, would not have provided the effect of compliancy, because we are needed to treat also the internal contamination, because it was over the risk assessment targets. So we needed to combine it with something which would need to be done directly internally. Probably would not have been a solution to consider plume stop also for the internal contamination, because it's too much high concentration for plume stop. Plume stop is a technology for plume, and the name itself says about it. So we cannot apply at such high concentration. So we needed something to deplete the contamination before, but once we have done it, and we have done it with ERD, we could have done it with ZVI, but once we've done it already, the situation was fully compliant, so there was no need for extra application. And really, plume stop we quite rarely apply into grid. It's more typically for barrier treatment to cut off a plume, and so avoiding transport. The second question was about how slow the remediation in Italy is. Well, it is fairly slow, probably one of the countries where it is slower. And it's first of all for the bureaucratic procedure and how these mechanisms go, which are not quick. Just to mention, so the site was ceasing activities in 2006. In 2008, they started the investigation, and it took up until 2015, so 7 years, to complete investigation, risk assessment, and get the remediation plan approved. So this was the longest portion of entire remediation. Then also the fact that we need to comply with stringent targets and measure in this complex way makes that the monitoring needs to go longer than an average other country European site for most of the cases. So if this site was in UK, for example, or in Spain or in other countries, probably the remediation would have completed much before, because, for example, just after applying plume stop, then a few months, and it was compliant to slightly higher levels. This is a cost. So it's a cost because we need to be more consistent with the treatments that are needed, but it's a cost for immobilization of properties that can't be redeveloped. But it's also a cost for activities that need to be implemented. So this site suffered from 12 years of hydraulic containment via pump and treat, which played a significant part in the total environmental costs that the client suffered.
So on the pump and treat thing, there's another. I'm going to let you answer this one because I don't know how to, because I didn't do it. Okay. How did you make the injections with an ongoing pump and treat system?
Yeah, this was pretty challenging. So what has been agreed and written down in the remediation plan, that it was possible to switch off single pumps while injecting in the immediate surrounding. And this was done with the ERD phase and also with the plume stop, but was just for allowing the product to distribute correctly and then to adhere and fix onto the soil, so not be pumped out. But after this, the pumps needed to be switched on again. Sorry. Okay. These provide additional complexity in the process because the pumps are disturbing. So probably a lot of the fluctuation that we are seeing at the point of compliance at the boundaries is given by the fact that they were not only monitoring wells, but they were also wells under pumping. So probably without any pumping, this fluctuation would have gone off and we would have reached compliance earlier. Also, when you pump, you can drag some air from the soil, and this air gets oxygen, so you are providing and enhancing an anaerobic process, and for sure the oxygen doesn't help to do this process at its maximum efficiency. But this is it. We need it since the beginning, so we need to cope with it.
No problem. So I'm going to finish off just with two questions, and then I have to run into another call. So that'll be it. So one question sort of around the site setting. So can this treatment be done in other sorts of geology like gravels or bedrock? The quick answer is yes. Actually, if you take a look on our website, I did an hour-long webinar on bedrock treatment, for example. ERD, generally speaking, is much easier to do in coarse geologies. In fact, Marcello alluded to it, that particularly with something like 3DME, sorry to make this very UK centric, but the kind of river terrace gravels that you would find around the London basin. And we've done injections there on 3 to 10 meter centers before. So because these compounds distribute very widely, you can really inject them on wide centers and accelerate your application program that way and reduce costs. Plume stop, again, on these coarser geologies, it can be done sort of fractured granite bedrock, so bringing it back to Scandinavia. That would be challenging, but ERD could certainly be something that we could look at. Typically, the limiting factor is just making sure that you're intercepting your fractures when you're doing these injections. Chalk is something we treat fairly routinely, utilizing these technologies that we talked about today. Same's true with our suite of technologies for petroleum hydrocarbons as well. But yeah, if you've got a bedrock site, of course, please feel free to reach out and I'm happy to chat it through with you. If you're not quite ready to do that, but maybe you're looking for tips on what further site investigation you could do, we've another webinar that talks about that in quite a lot of detail on the website. The final question that I'll answer, do we offer guarantees on all types of sites? That's a very it's a very specific site-specific question. So there will be sites we can't guarantee. However, we are very open to guaranteeing and warrantying our technologies. So some of the key conditions of this are we would need to be there to do the application works. So if you're looking for us to stand by a design, we would need to undertake those injection works. The reason for that is if a third party does it, we can't know for sure if they've done it correctly. So we would have to do those injections. We can, in terms of what those guarantees would look like, it could be pay for performance. I think, you know, in the case of this site, some money was held back and was only released once the site was signed off. We can be quite flexible in how we can warranty and guarantee these sorts of sites. For PFAS contamination, this is something we do more routinely. We have a commercial offering called Plume Shield, which I think sounds a bit like a Marvel superhero, but we essentially assume that liability around the PFAS contamination in the groundwater. So the answer is yes, we do. There will be types of sites that we can't do it, but the overarching theme is that we would need to do those application works in order to offer those sorts of guarantees or warranties. Yeah, there are plenty of other questions that Marcello and I have to get back to you guys and answer. First of all, thank you, Marcello, for taking the time to speak to this audience. No problem. You know, I find it really interesting and fascinating. It's just a completely different world of remediation in Italy than it is in sort of my district. You know, everybody on the line, we will send you out a survey. So if you could please fill that out. If you are keen to hear, you know, stories and case studies from other parts of Europe, please let us know and we can arrange more of these. These surveys are really important to us. It highlights, you know, where we can improve and what we're doing well. And if you have a site that you would like to talk to myself about or Marcello, please feel free to reach out utilizing the contact details that you can see below. But other than that, yeah, thanks again, Marcello. Thanks everyone for making the time to listen to us.
Yeah, thanks to everybody and see you again.
Wonderful. Speak to you soon. Cheers then.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.